The Menendez brothers spent $1 million of their father's fortune in the first 6 months after his life ended. While the world saw a Beverly Hills tragedy, the internal ledgers of the Menendez estate revealed an estimated $14 million estate that had effectively become a death warrant. But behind the Beverly Hills mansion, Jose Menendez was running his family like a hostile takeover. He didn't just raise sons, he managed assets until those assets decided to liquidate him. But the one thing he could not calculate was the cost of his own legacy. The night of the murders wasn't an outburst. It was the final audit of a $15 million life insurance policy Jose had signed himself. A policy with a clause so toxic it made his death more profitable than his life. This is the dark history of the Menendez execution. Jose Menendez arrived in America with nothing but the clothes on his back and a cold, calculating ambition. He did not just want the American dream, he wanted to own it. He started at the bottom, working in a commercial cleaning business, but his mind was built for high-stakes accounting. By the age of 25, he was a rising star in the corporate world. He saw people as assets or liabilities, nothing more.
He married Kitty, a woman who matched his drive for social standing, and together they began a ruthless ascent. Jose did not just work hard. He eliminated his competition with surgical precision. He eventually landed a seat at the table of RCA Records. This was not about music. It was about market share and crushing the margins. He was the man who signed some of the biggest acts of the 1980s, but he treated them like line items on a balance sheet. He was building an empire on a foundation of absolute control. This obsession with dominance was not merely a professional strategy. It was a biological imperative that defined his character. Jose Menendez operated with the belief that the world was divided into two categories, the predators and the prey. He viewed empathy as a structural weakness in a person's psychological architecture. When he analyzed a business deal, he was not looking for a partnership. He was looking for a total acquisition of the other party's resources. This mindset allowed him to navigate the treacherous waters of the 1980s entertainment industry with a level of efficiency that terrified his peers. He was a master of the hostile takeover, a man who understood that in the corporate world, you do not ask for power, you seize it. His rise within the ranks of the corporate elite was fueled by an almost pathological need to be the smartest person in the room. He would spend hours dissecting the financial statements of his rivals, looking for the one single vulnerability that would allow him to collapse their operations. He was not interested in the creative process of the entertainment business. To Jose, a platinum record was simply a high-yield asset that required careful management to maximize. Long before his life ended in the infamous Beverly Hills murders of 1989, he had already become a man defined by his uncompromising pursuit of wealth. By the mid-1980s, Jose Menendez had transitioned from a corporate predator into a certified titan of the home video revolution. As the chief operating officer of live entertainment, he sat at the epicenter of a multi-billion-dollar shift in how the world consumed media. His annual base salary reached $500,000, but that was merely the surface of his accumulation. Through aggressive stock options, performance bonuses, and shrewd personal investments, his net worth climbed toward $15 million. He wasn't just participating in the industry, he was dictating its terms. He saw the shift from celluloid to magnetic tape not as an artistic evolution, but as a logistical conquest. Jose moved his family into a Mediterranean-style mansion in $4.8 million that cost $4 million. This wasn't just a home,
It was a physical manifestation of his dominance over the Beverly Hills landscape. The property was a fortress of limestone and luxury, featuring a guest house, a swimming pool, and a private tennis court where his sons were expected to perform like professionals. Inside these walls, the true story of the Menendez brothers began to take a darker turn. Jose ran the household with the same cold, analytical detachment he used to gut failing subsidiaries. He didn't see his children as sons. He saw them as long-term capital investments that needed to yield a specific social return. Lyle and Erik were subjected to a regime of psychological conditioning designed to strip away any trace of perceived weakness. Jose demanded absolute perfection in every metric, from their ranking on the national tennis circuit to their social standing among the elite of Los Angeles. He believed that by applying immense pressure, he could forge them into reflections of his own ruthless image. However, he failed to realize that he was essentially training them in the art of the hostile takeover.
He taught them that empathy was a liability and that the only currency with any real value was total, unmitigated power. The financial infrastructure of the Menendez household was built on a foundation of absolute control and conditional access. While the world saw a family living the ultimate American dream, the reality was a high-stakes game of emotional and financial leverage. Jose used the estimated $14 million estate as a weapon, frequently threatening to disinherit the boys if they failed to meet his impossible standards. He was molding his successors, but he was also creating his own worst enemies. He showed them that in the world of high finance, the person holding the pen at the end of the day is the only one who truly exists. As the boys grew older, the psychological warfare intensified, mirroring the brutal mechanics of a corporate merger. Jose would often pit Lyle and Erik against one another, forcing them to compete for his approval and his resources. This environment of scarcity amidst extreme abundance created a volatile paradox. The boys had access to everything money could buy, yet they possessed no agency over their own lives. They were the crown princes of a kingdom they were forbidden to rule. This obsession with building a monopoly over his sons' futures would eventually lead to the most catastrophic breach of contract in the history of Beverly Hills. While Jose focused on the external optics of his empire, the internal rot was becoming undeniable. He spent his days at Live Entertainment negotiating deals that would define the home video era, but his nights were spent dismantling the spirits of the two people meant to carry his legacy. He believed he was building a dynasty that would last for generations. In reality, he was redlining the emotional capacity of his sons, pushing them toward a breaking point that no amount of wealth could fix. The gilded life was becoming a prison, and the inmates were beginning to study the blueprints of their own cage. The threat of losing the fortune triggered a desperate, lethal calculation in the minds of the brothers. The Menendez lifestyle was a masterclass in excess, a carefully curated exhibition of what absolute financial victory looked like in the late 1980s. Jose did not just want to be wealthy. He wanted to project the image of a sovereign ruler within the zip code of 90210. The family's Mediterranean-style mansion became the stage for a performance of perfection, where every detail was calculated for maximum impact. They possessed a fleet of luxury cars that sat in the driveway like trophies, including a custom Porsche and several high-end European sedans that signaled their arrival at the pinnacle of the American social hierarchy. This was the true story of the Menendez brothers living as the princes of Beverly Hills, a world where private tutors, exclusive country clubs, and first-class travel were not luxuries, but basic expectations. Jose was obsessed with the optics of his dynasty, viewing his sons as the ultimate marketing materials for his personal brand of success. He pushed Lyle into Princeton University with the same aggressive force he used to acquire market share in the music industry. It did not matter that the boy lacked the academic rigor or the grades required for such a prestigious institution. In Jose's world, money and influence could bypass any gatekeeper. He believed that by placing his sons in the most elite environments, he was solidifying the family's status as old money, despite their rapid and ruthless ascent. The boys were surrounded by the finest things the world could offer, yet they were becoming increasingly aware that they were merely tenants in their father's empire, subject to eviction at any moment. Inside the $4 million mansion, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the crushing weight of impossible standards. Kitty and Jose Menendez maintained a household that functioned with the cold efficiency of a corporate headquarters. While the public saw a family that had achieved everything, the reality was a high-pressure vacuum. The boys were given unlimited credit cards and access to the most exclusive circles in Los Angeles. But every dollar spent was a tether back to Jose's control. He used wealth as a weapon, rewarding compliance with luxury and punishing any perceived weakness with psychological isolation. The gilded life was a beautiful mask, covering a structure that was beginning to crack under the strain of Jose's relentless ego. As the late 80s progressed, Jose's paranoia regarding his legacy began to manifest in increasingly volatile ways. He started to view his sons not as successors, but as liabilities who were too soft to survive the corporate jungle he had conquered. This is a central theme in many a Menendez brothers documentary, highlighting the moment the carrot of inheritance turned into a stick of intimidation. Jose began openly threatening to write Lyle and Erik out of his will, a document that held the keys to a $15 million fortune. He frequently reminded them that he had arrived in America with nothing, and that he was perfectly capable of leaving them with nothing if they did not meet his exacting demands for excellence on the tennis court and in the boardroom. The psychological warfare reached a fever pitch as the brothers realized that their entire future was a moving target. They were living in a house filled with Menendez brothers' crime scene photos waiting to happen, though the world only saw the polished exterior. Jose's threats were not merely idle words. He was a man who lived by the spreadsheet, and he was ready to liquidate his emotional investment in his children. He told them they were failures, that they lacked the killer instinct required to maintain the Menendez name. Ironically, by constantly challenging their survival and threatening their financial lifeblood, he was inadvertently teaching them the very ruthlessness he claimed they lacked. He was showing them that in his world, power was the only currency, and the person who held the pen held the life of everyone else in the room. The tension within the mansion was a silent, suffocating force that dictated every interaction. Lyle and Erik were trapped in a paradox where they had everything they could ever want, but owned absolutely none of it. They were young men who had been raised to value status above all else. Yet they were being told that their status was a temporary loan that could be called in at any time. This financial insecurity, wrapped in the trappings of extreme wealth, created a lethal psychological cocktail. They watched as their father continued to amass power at live entertainment, knowing that the larger the empire grew, the more they stood to lose if Jose decided to follow through on his threats to disinherit them. By the summer of 1989, the gilded life had become a gilded cage with the door slowly swinging shut. The brothers were no longer just spoiled socialites.
They were becoming desperate actors in a high-stakes drama of their father's making. They saw their mother, Kitty, as a complicit figure who had traded her own autonomy for the security of Jose's millions. The family dynamic had devolved into a Cold War, with the estimated $14 million estate serving as the ultimate prize. They were the princes of Beverly Hills, but they were beginning to realize that a prince is nothing until the king is gone. The obsession with the Menendez brothers' defense testimony would later focus on this era of their lives, attempting to explain how such luxury could breed such profound resentment. The brothers were now looking at their father through the same cold, analytical lens he had used on his corporate rivals. They saw a tyrant who was prepared to erase their futures to satisfy his own sense of control. The threat of being cut off from the fortune triggered a shift in their perception. They no longer saw a father, but an obstacle to the life they believed they deserved. The American dream that Jose had built was about to be dismantled by the very people he had built it for. The final calculation was being made in the shadows of the Beverly Hills mansion, as the brothers prepared to move from the role of the hunted to the role of the hunters.
The transition from the peak of their social power to the planning of a fatal event was seamless and chillingly logical. They had been raised in an environment where winning was the only metric of success, and where the cost of losing was total annihilation. As the sun set over the palm trees of $4.8 million, the brothers were no longer thinking about tennis matches or Princeton social clubs. They were thinking about the mechanics of a takeover. They were looking at the estimated approximately $15 million, not as a gift to be earned, but as a bounty to be taken. The era of the gilded life was ending, and the era of the execution was about to begin. The threat of losing the fortune triggered a desperate, lethal calculation in the minds of the brothers. They realized that as long as Jose held the pen, their lives were not their own. To secure the empire, they would have to eliminate the emperor. This was the moment the legacy of Jose Menendez turned into a death warrant for the entire bloodline, as the brothers prepared to execute the ultimate hostile takeover. The calculation for the Beverly Hills murders of 1989 did not begin with a flare of temper or a sudden argument over dinner. It began with the cold, analytical precision that Jose Menendez had drilled into his sons since they were children. Lyle and Erik Menendez understood that the estimated $14 million estate was a shifting target. Their father had spent his entire career restructuring companies and purging dead weight, and now he was looking at his own sons through that same corporate lens. He saw them as failing assets. He had openly discussed altering his will to ensure that his fortune would not be squandered by two young men he deemed soft and undisciplined. For the brothers, this was not just a family dispute. It was a looming bankruptcy of their entire future. To prevent the liquidation of their inheritance, they decided to act with the same ruthlessness their father used to dominate the entertainment industry. They didn't just want to escape his control. They wanted to seize the capital. The planning was methodical, mirroring the due diligence of a hostile takeover. They traveled to Culver City to purchase two 12-gauge Mossberg shotguns, using a stolen driver's license to mask the paper trail. This was a deliberate choice of weaponry, designed to create a scene so devastating that the authorities would immediately look toward professional hitmen rather than family members. They were banking on the idea that the sheer brutality of the act would serve as their ultimate alibi. On the night of August 20th, 1989, The quiet of the Mediterranean-style mansion was shattered. Jose and Kitty Menendez were in the den, watching television and eating dessert, completely unaware that the corporate culture of violence Jose had fostered was about to walk through the door. The brothers entered and unleashed a barrage of fire that was excessive even by the standards of organized crime. Jose was eliminated first, struck by a shot to the back of the head that ensured he would never have the chance to sign a new will. Kitty, in a desperate attempt to flee, was hunted down in the hallway. The brothers fired over 10 shots in total, Lyle returning to their car to retrieve more ammunition when they ran out of ammunition to finish the job. The crime scene was a vision of absolute carnage, a physical manifestation of the resentment that had been simmering beneath the surface of their gilded life. When the police arrived, they found a house that looked like a war zone. The brothers had played their roles to perfection, crying on the front lawn and telling stories of a mysterious mob hit related to Jose's business dealings. They relied on the prejudice of the era, believing that the sons of a multimillionaire would never be capable of such visceral savagery. It was a gamble based on social standing and the optics of wealth, a strategy that Jose himself had used to climb the ranks of RCA and live entertainment. The initial investigation was paralyzed by the scale of the violence. Detectives spent months chasing leads in the home video industry, looking for disgruntled executives or rivals who might have wanted Jose dead. The true story of the Menendez brothers was hidden behind a wall of high-priced lawyers and a carefully curated image of grieving orphans. They had successfully liquidated the primary obstacles to their fortune. Now they were the sole heirs to an empire built on blood and spreadsheets. They believed they had committed the perfect crime, an efficient removal of leadership that would leave them in total control of the estimated $14 million prize. However, the brothers lacked the one thing that made their father a titan: the ability to delay gratification. While the police were still cataloging evidence and analyzing crime scene photos, Lyle and Erik began to behave as if they had just won the lottery rather than lost their parents. The transition from grieving sons to high-stakes gamblers was nearly instantaneous. They were no longer under the thumb of the man who turned human beings into spreadsheets. They were finally free to spend, and they did so with a level of recklessness that would eventually provide the very evidence the police needed to dismantle their defense. The fatal flaw in their plan wasn't the execution itself, but the psychological fallout that followed. They had the money, they had the mansion, and they had the freedom they had craved for years. But the weight of the estimated $14 million estate was beginning to crack the foundation of their composure. They had learned how to kill like their father, but they hadn't learned how to live with the consequences of a hostile takeover. As the weeks turned into months, the professional hit theory began to evaporate, replaced by a growing suspicion that the real monsters were the ones who stood to gain the most from the tragedy. The brothers believed they had executed the perfect exit strategy, but they failed to account for the forensic accounting of human guilt. In the immediate aftermath, Lyle and Erik Menendez began a spree of consumption that would have made their father proud. They didn't mourn, they shopped. Lyle purchased a $15,000 Rolex and a $64,000 Porsche Carrera, while Erik hired a full-time tennis coach for $60,000 a year. Within the first 6 months, they had burned through $1 million of the family estate. To the outside world, they were the grieving heirs of the Beverly Hills murders 1989. To the financial investigators watching the estate's ledgers,
They were two young men acting with the reckless abandon of lottery winners who had finally eliminated their competition. The true story of the Menendez brothers is often framed as a psychological thriller, but the mechanics of their downfall were rooted in a specific $15 million life insurance policy. This was the open loop that Jose Menendez had unknowingly left behind as a trap for his own children. To collect the payout, the beneficiaries had to be cleared of any involvement in the fatal event. The insurance company's investigators, motivated by the desire to protect their own bottom line, were far more meticulous than the initial police task force. They didn't care about the Menendez brothers' defense testimony or the emotional state of the family. They cared about the timeline of the asset liquidation.
They saw two boys who were treating an estimated $14 million estate like a bottomless credit card, while the blood was barely dry on the den floor. As the financial walls began to close in, the psychological structural integrity of the brothers started to fail. Erik, the younger and more sensitive of the two, was the first to buckle under the weight of the secret. He was consumed by the kind of guilt that no amount of luxury could mask. In a moment of absolute desperation, he turned to his therapist, Dr. Jerome Oziel. He confessed everything, detailing how they had planned the execution to secure their future and the estate. This was the moment the corporate-style hit was dismantled. The brothers had operated under the assumption of doctor-patient confidentiality, but they had neglected the fine print of the law. When they allegedly threatened the therapist, the privilege was voided, and the secret spilled into the hands of the therapist's mistress. The mistress, a woman named Judalon Smith, became the unlikely catalyst for the collapse of the Menendez empire. She went to the police to report the existence of the confession, effectively handing the prosecution the keys to the kingdom. Suddenly, the Menendez brothers documentary that the world was watching shifted from a mystery to a tragedy of errors. The police realized that the professional hit theory was a smokescreen. The brothers weren't masterminds. They were children who had tried to play a high-stakes game of corporate warfare without understanding the rules of engagement. The estimated approximately $15 million they had killed for was no longer a prize. It was now a legal war chest that was being drained by the hour to pay for a defense that seemed increasingly impossible. The arrest of Lyle and Erik Menendez didn't just end their spending spree. It triggered a total liquidation of the family's assets. The luxury cars were seized, the private tutors were dismissed, and the Mediterranean mansion became a crime scene frozen in time. The very wealth that had motivated the crime was now the primary evidence against them. Prosecutors used the $700,000 spending spree as a roadmap of their intent. They argued that the motive wasn't fear or abuse, but the cold, calculating desire to inherit the Jose and Kitty Menendez fortune before Jose could follow through on his threats to disinherit them. The brothers had traded their parents' lives for a seat at the table of the elite, only to find that the table had been repossessed. By the time the trial began, the public was obsessed with every detail of the Menendez brothers' crime scene photos and the sensational nature of the case. But beneath the media circus was a simple story of a balance sheet that didn't add up. The $5 million insurance policy was never in effect because Jose hadn't completed the physical exam. The insurance company successfully argued that the brothers had forfeited their right to the funds. The brothers were now in a position where they had to spend their remaining inheritance to fight for their lives. It was a cruel irony that Jose Menendez would have likely appreciated. The money was being recycled back into the system,
feeding the lawyers and the court reporters, leaving the heirs with nothing but a public trial and a looming life sentence. The collapse was total and irreversible. The myth of the perfect Beverly Hills family had been replaced by the reality of a broken dynasty. As the brothers sat in the courtroom, listening to the prosecution dismantle their character, they realized that the estimated $14 million death warrant was finally being served. They had tried to buy their freedom with blood, but they had forgotten that in the world of high-stakes finance, there is always a higher power that audits the books. The secret they thought was buried in a therapist's office had become a global headline, and the legacy of Jose Menendez was being liquidated in front of the entire world. The dream of the American dynasty had officially turned into a cautionary tale of greed and the high cost of a corporate execution. The liquidation of a legacy is rarely as swift as its creation. By the time the final gavel fell on the second trial, the Menendez estate had been picked clean by the very system designed to protect it. Every cent of the estimated $14 million estate was caught in a legal meat grinder that spared no one. The $4 million mansion on $4.8 million, once a symbol of Jose's ultimate victory, became a stagnant asset that sat on the market for years. It eventually sold for far less than its purchase price, a grim reminder that the market has no mercy for property stained by such a violent history. The fleet of luxury cars and the expensive jewelry were auctioned off to pay for a defense that ultimately failed to keep the brothers out of a cage. The autopsy of this empire reveals a terrifying financial reality. The massive $15 million life insurance policy, which was the central pillar of the brothers' post-execution plan, remained frozen in litigation. Because the law prohibits a person from profiting from their own crime, the insurance company successfully fought to keep the funds. This left the estate to pay for two of the most expensive legal defenses in California history. By 1996, the Menendez brothers' documentary of their own making had reached its final act. The brothers, who once spent $1 million in 6 months, were now wards of the state, possessing nothing but the blue denim of their prison uniforms and the memories of a life they traded for a 12-gauge shotgun. Today, the true story of the Menendez brothers is often told through the lens of pop culture and media sensationalism. But beneath the surface of the Netflix dramatizations and the social media debates lies a cold, mathematical truth. Jose Menendez believed he was building a dynasty that would last for generations, yet he managed to destroy it in less than 3 decades. He taught his sons that humans were assets to be managed, and that the only metric for success was the bottom line. When Lyle and Erik Menendez applied that same corporate logic to their own home life, they didn't see parents, they saw obstacles to their liquid net worth. The tragedy wasn't just the loss of life, but the complete erasure of a family's history through the very greed that defined it. In the decades since the Beverly Hills murders, 1989, the brothers have lived separate lives behind bars, only recently being reunited in the same facility. Their defense testimony remains one of the most polarizing moments in legal history, sparking endless debate over whether they were victims of a monster or monsters themselves. However, the financial ledger is far less ambiguous. The estate is gone. The name Menendez is no longer synonymous with corporate power at RCA or live entertainment. Instead, it serves as a permanent entry in the annals of American crime. They found out too late that the estimated approximately $15 million they killed for was a mirage, a figure on a spreadsheet that they would never actually touch. The modern legacy of Kitty and Jose Menendez is a cautionary tale for the ultra-wealthy. It proves that when you treat your children like a hostile takeover, you shouldn't be surprised when they respond with a scorched earth policy. The empire didn't fall because of a bad investment or a market crash. It fell because the foundation was built on absolute control rather than absolute trust. The brothers thought they were the ones conducting the execution, but they were actually the ones being executed by their father's own philosophy.
In the world of high finance and high stakes, the house always wins. And in this case, the house was a $4 million tomb in the heart of Beverly Hills. Wealth is a gravity that pulls everything toward the center. Jose Menendez built a center that was too heavy to hold. He treated his family like a corporation, and in the end, that corporation went bankrupt in the most violent way possible. You can buy a mansion in Beverly Hills, but you can't buy a way out of your own nature. If you want to see how other empires fell under the weight of their own gold, hit the subscribe button. The history of money is written in blood. This was the Menendez execution. Don't let the next one start without you.